What's up, everybody? I'm Jason, and welcome back to another episode of the podcast here on the Points in Focus channel. Now, if you have been paying any attention to the news, and camera news at least recently, you have probably seen that Canon has announced two new cameras, the R1 and the R5 Mark II. And in this video, I am going to be talking about the R5 Mark II because I looked at the R1 and it's expensive and I'm probably not buying one anytime soon. Now, that said, before I get into all of this, I want to make a couple of notes about what you can expect in this video. First, I am not a Canon ambassador. I am not paid for by Canon. I don't get any free gear from Canon, and I don't get gear early or ahead of releases or anything like that. What that means is that I don't have an R5 Mark II yet. So none of this is my hands-on experience with the camera. Instead, I have read the specs, I have looked at the press material, I have looked at what early reviews are out, and well, I have some talking points. I don't want to call them concerns because they're not really concerns. I just have some points that are interesting. Interesting to me, at least. Now, that said, as with all modern cameras, to just even talk about every spec or read the spec sheet could take hours to go down the list, and I don't want to spend that much time on this. So I have set up some notes. I am going to go through my notes, but in the post, I am going to probably come back and edit out whole sections of this video talking about things that just aren't as important as I think they as my other topics are, other points are. So if things jump around a little bit, that's why that's going on. Now, as I said, I don't get my gear for free. I have to buy it, which means that I have to be very critical of what it is that I am looking for or buying when I'm buying things. I think it puts me very much in the same kind of boat as all of you guys. Of course, now when I get the gear, I will be testing it. We're talking about it further. So that brings me to the last thing I want to say kind of as an intro point here, which is this will be the last video that I do on the R5 Mark II until I have one. I'm not going to keep beating the dead horse until I have a camera that I can actually beat. I don't think it's a valuable waste of time or use of time. And in fact, in some respects, as I consider even this to be somewhat of a waste of time in that I have spent 2 days working on reading the specs and whatnot. Okay, it's not completely a waste of time because I needed to do a lot of that to understand what it was that I was buying before I pre-ordered it and make that decision. But I think this is a waste of time because I have spent now 2 days trying to do this video to talk about what's interesting about the camera, when I should have been using that time to work on the content that I had actually intended to be working on for, well, the 2 days of this week that I have been working on this. And I think that would have been a much better use of time. So there will be no more R5 Mark II content after this video until I have the camera and I can actually start talking about it really intelligently with one in my hand. So with that said, let's start talking about the camera. So I want to start talking about the body and camera overall design. And basically, overall, the camera is an R5. From what I can tell, it looks basically identical to the R5. Controls are all pretty much in the same place. The viewfinder is bigger. We'll talk about that in a second. But by and large, R5 Mark II, with two small exceptions, you shouldn't really see much of a difference in terms of usability, ergonomics, etc. The two exceptions are that the power switch has been relocated, so it is no longer on the left side of the camera. I've seen some people say that that's not where it should be. I've seen other people say that Canon's now put it where it should be. I can't make such a concrete comment on that because I've never had a problem with the power switch being on the offhand side of the camera. I've never had a problem with the power switch being on the other side of the camera. And I go back to when the power switch used to be on the back of the camera near the dial at the bottom, you know, in like the 40D and the 1D Mark III. So it has been all over the place. Moving it is not really that big of a deal. Now, replacing what used to be where the power switch was on the top of the camera is now the photo video mode switch. I don't know if I actually like this. So the argument that the power switch is better on the left or the grip side of the camera because it's closer to your hand doesn't ring true to me. it's bad UI design as far as I'm concerned, or it's a bad assertion of UI design. So if you are familiar with anything with UI design, you probably run into, I can't think of the name of the principle anymore. Mac users always used to like arguing about it with the menu bar at the top of the screen versus in the window. But basically it says that the easier a control is to access, it's either going to be closer to you or your fingers or your hand or whatever you're accessing with, or it needs to be bigger. Now the reality is you shouldn't have to flip the power of the camera on and off that much. And when you are flipping the power on and off, you should have a hand free, or it shouldn't really matter because the camera should go to sleep and use basically as much power when it's asleep as it does when it's off. So the argument that the power switch is better on the grip side where it's closer to your hand when you're holding the camera and more accessible, for me doesn't really ring true because that's not something that I do a lot. I turn my camera on, I leave it on for the entire duration of what I'm shooting. Now on the other hand, the photo video switch is something that I do change with some regularity, maybe not as much as many other settings, well, certainly not as much as many other settings, but certainly it's something that I change with some regularity when I'm shooting to go into a specific video mode. And on the R5, of course, you do that by hitting the mode button and hitting info to switch between photo and video modes. On the R5 Mark II, you're now going to have to reach up or over to the left hand, the non-grip side or the port side of the camera, and you're going to have to flip a switch there. I don't really think, for me, that's not as great, or that's not an improvement in usability. The other thing that I don't like with the power switch as Canon's has moved it is now a combination of power and control lock. So the switch has three positions: off, lock, and on. And this isn't new. This is something Canon did. My 1D Mark III did this. I want to even say my 40D might have done this, but I don't remember if it had a control lock. But certainly my 1D Mark III did this. And what it means from a usability perspective is instead of just hitting a button to lock the controls, you're now going to have to flip a switch. And if you overflip the switch to lock the controls, you turn your camera off, which you might not want to do. Now, I don't know what the extent of how Canon's dealing with the control lock on the R5 Mark II versus the R5. On the R5, you could lock only a certain control. Like you could lock the top dial that controls the ISO so that when the lock was enabled, that control didn't function, but everything else functioned normally. That's kind of going to be an annoying thing if you're used to using the camera that way and you have the new lock switch set up that way and you go to lock it to disable the ISO dial and you turn your camera off. I don't really care for that. And in my experience, going back to like the 1D Mark III, I never used the lock position. It was always click, click on and click, click off. And lock was just something that was in the way, so to speak. It was a setting to jump over. Now, the other thing that they've changed, a couple other things that they've changed on the top of the camera, they now have a tally light. So similar to the R5C, it's above the logo on the port side of the camera. So that's a useful thing. Hopefully we'll be able to disable it. Tally lights are always good if you need them to be able to inform people that the camera is recording. But anytime you're shooting on, say, a closed set, or you have a reflective surface that can pick up the light and reflect it back to the camera, then it becomes something that you're going to have to tape over or turn off. So hopefully we can turn that off. Now, a lot of people have complained about the HDMI port, it being a micro HDMI port or an HDMI Type-C port on the R5 and the R5C. Well, it's now a full-size HDMI port on the R5 Mark II. Great. Now, does that mean that you don't have to care anymore? Because the complaint, obviously, with the micro HDMI port is that it's fragile and people break it. And, well, the reality is HDMI ports can be broken too. And I am very much of the opinion that if you are using a camera with a monitor, you should have some form of cable management and strain relief so that if that monitor cable HDMI cable gets caught on something, it doesn't damage your camera. And it doesn't really matter if you're using a micro HDMI port, a mini HDMI port, or a full-size HDMI port. For that, you should still be doing that. And it also does look like Canon is still providing their port protector, or whatever they call it, which if you ever actually look at that in real use, the biggest utility of that is the ability to loop the cable around it, usually the HDMI cable, and provide strain relief more so than the whole lining the ports up. I mean, that certainly helps, and it certainly helps make it more difficult to, say, bend the connector on the port. But again, even with full-size HDMI, I don't think you shouldn't be like taking it for granted that it's going to not ever break and that you don't have to worry about it. I think as with anything, you should be wiring your camera up as cleanly and as tightly as possible with the various cables so that you don't have to worry about your ports getting damaged. Something else I noticed when I was looking around the camera is it looks like Canon is continuing to use the same top LCD. So it is white text on black by default. I don't know, and I haven't seen anything if there is a way to turn that from black on or white on black to black on white. At least not without turning on the black backlight. Personally, I don't like the top LCDs on pretty much everything now. I find it very difficult to read black text or the white text on the black background. I know it looks cool because the LCD is black like the rest of the camera and it's sleek and it's integrated. And it's fine. I will admit it is perfectly fine. And if I'm outside in full sunlight or whatever, and it's a bright environment, I don't ever have a problem with it. But there is very much a period or level of darkness where it's not so dark that I need the backlight to be able to see anything, but I have a hard time reading the top LCD without turning the backlight on, and it would be a lot easier, in my opinion, to read be able to use the LCD inverted in white or black on white mode as opposed to white on black mode. Now, the other good news, as far as I'm concerned, comes with the EVF. So physically, it's bigger. It obviously now has the eye control autofocus, which I think is going to be a very interesting thing to have. I'm a little bit of a mixed review opinion on that in the sense that I wear glasses and I've heard conflicting reports about how it works with people who wear glasses. I also wear sunglasses all the time when I'm outside, or at least almost all the time when I'm outside. And I know from Canon's own thing that polarized, reflective, and dark sunglasses have difficulty or will prevent it from functioning. So that's potentially an issue there with respect to the eye control stuff, but I'm glad it's on the camera because on the flip side, people who have used it and have gotten used to not having to push buttons or push the multi-controller around have said in many places that I've read that it's like very difficult to go back to a camera that doesn't have it because now the autofocus is literally working where you're looking, which is kind of what you want it to do. But that said, eye control aside, which has made the housing a little bigger, the EVF itself is supposed to be 2x or twice as bright, which I think is actually a really good thing because quite honestly, I have had problems with my R5's EVF and R5C's EVF outside in various conditions. And a couple of times I kind of wrote it off saying, well, it's not really the camera, it's the situation I'm in. Like I was shooting in snow, and so that's a very bright environment with a lot of reflected light. But I've also had that be an issue when I'm not shooting in snow on clear, bright days. And the more I have run into it, the more I have realized that the EVF really does need to be brighter for that kind of situation. It is helpful. Especially going back to if you wear sunglasses or something like that, you're cutting down the light from everything, including the light from the EVF, which means the EVF has to be brighter. Now, along this whole topic, Canon still does not have replaceable or interchangeable eye cups for the EVF on the R5. It's a different format than the R5 or the R5 Mark II, but it's a different format than the R5, but they're not replaceable or interchangeable. They do this, or do have replaceable / interchangeable eye cups on the R3 and the R1. And both of those also have the eye control AF. So it's not like the eye control AF can't work with a replaceable eye cup. Now, normally this probably shouldn't be that big of a problem. However, the place where I find it problematic is with rain covers. If I am shooting in an incredibly rainy environment or heavily raining, heavy rainstorm or something like that, I want a rain cover on my camera for the added level of protection. Yes, it's dust and weather sealed, but dust and weather sealing is not a perfect solution to keep the camera completely sealed. Plus now for the cooling in the movie mode, there's actually a duct runs through the camera, which in theory should be sealed, but it's a duct running through the inside of the camera, and we'll get to that too. Most rain covers, my point being is that most rain covers that have the ability for you to use the rain cover while shooting. So I'm thinking about things like Think Tank's Hydrophobia series. Use a replaceable eye cup, have their own eye cup that anchors and seals the rain cover to the back of the camera so that you can see through the viewfinder and actually use the camera. So the combination of a larger viewfinder housing, which makes it harder to stretch the neoprene just over the camera, which is what I do with my R5 now, with the lack of a replaceable or removable or interchangeable, whatever you want to call it, eye cup so that the rain covers can't leverage that, is a little bit of a frustrating, it's a niche thing, but it's a frustrating thing to me, and it's a thing that I have not seen, again, anybody talk about when talking about the camera and so forth. Now, also new with the camera are 3 new grips. 2 new battery grips and a base. So there are 3 grips that Canon has released for the camera. First is the BGR20. This is the least expensive. It's your standard battery grip, takes 2 batteries, hooks up to the camera basically the same way as the camera, a BGR10 on the R5 does. Stepping up from that, they have the BGR20EP. The EP stands for Ethernet port. This includes, it's basically the standard battery grip with an added 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port on it. So Canon is making, through the grips at least, high-speed wired connectivity a point to the camera, which I think is a good thing, especially in more production environments where you might want to quickly transfer data off the camera or potentially even stream data off the camera. I'm not sure what the exact situation is in that respect yet. The final, and I don't even want to call it a grip, I want to call it a base, is the CFR20EP, and this is the cooling fan base with a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port so that you have that high-speed connectivity. Now, I call this a base because it has no controls on it. It just provides power and cooling through an integrated duct that works in the camera or through the camera that exhausts out the side of the camera near the USB-C port or behind the USB-C port. No controls, so this is really just a thing for people who are shooting video in the more demanding cases. And I will talk about this a little bit more when I talk about video because I have some questions about all of this. Now, all 3 of those grips provide power from 2 LP-E6 series batteries. The camera uses a new battery or comes with a new battery, the LP-E6P. However, the LP-E6N and NH batteries are also compatible with the camera, according to Canon at least, but the original LP-E6s aren't. So I already talked a little bit about the cooling grip, the CFR20EP, and It works with there's a duct that goes through the camera. The intake is on the bottom in front of, or behind, well, in front of the LCD panel. It basically goes up and then out the side where the USB-C port is and provides some cooling. Now, the question that is burning in my mind, and I have not seen concrete answers to yet, and will be one of the things that I will be testing when I get my camera, is what modes actually require the cooling. So from where things stand now, it doesn't actually appear to be a complete thermal solution in the sense that the cooling system on the R5C is. The R5C will shoot 8K indefinitely. It does not care. There is enough cooling capacity on that camera that it will not just, oh, I can go for 30 minutes and shut off. Now, Canon is saying with the cooling base on the R5 Mark II, if you are shooting at 8K 30 frames per second in MP4 format, you get about 75, or expect about 75 minutes of continuous recording with the low fan speed setting and 120 minutes or more recording at the high fan speed setting. Now, these are perfectly reasonable numbers, and it's very easy to, I think, kind of go down the path of, why need more? More. But for, I think, the vast majority of instances where anybody should be shooting at 8K 30, you're probably going to be good with this. Now, the question then becomes, well, what about 8K 60 RAW, which I think the camera will do? I'm pretty sure I saw that in the specs. I don't know if I'd have to be. What about fine? When the camera's downsampling 8K to 4K and you're shooting at 4K 60 in fine or 4K 30 in fine, how long does that run, and so forth? On the flip side, if you aren't shooting at these highest quality modes, do you even need to consider a cooling grip? That's the whole thing that is not entirely clear to me, is that maybe the cooling grip is sort of extraneous for most users' use cases. Except, the one thing I would go back and note is, one of the reasons that all cinema cameras have built-in cooling solutions of some sort isn't just to keep them from overheating. It's to keep them consistently hot, or cool, depending on how you look at it. What you don't want in a production environment where you're shooting take after take after take is the first take to look great and have no thermal noise issues, and the black, the darks, the shadows, the blacks are really good. And then when you get to take 10 or 15, well, now the blacks look not so great, and thermal noise is starting to become a problem, and everything is just not the same quality that it was in the first take. As long as it's consistent, things are fine. It's that inconsistency that creates problems. And even on the on the flip side of, do you need a cooling base? Even if you were shooting without using the higher end or the highest data rate or the highest power recording options or modes, you might want the cooling base to keep the camera at a consistent temperature, not so much for the overheat, but just to maintain image quality. Now, speaking of grips and bases, power is a very interesting situation on this camera. Canon does not have in their published specifications shots per battery or battery life tests or whatever. The digital picture had battery life tests. They were saying about 300 pictures per battery using the CPIA standard test process. But then he was also saying that when he was shooting with the camera, he would get like 5,000 pictures of battery when in the continuous drive modes. And this is actually not all that unsurprising to me, given my experience like with the 1D Mark III, where I shot an air show with it at 10 frames a second, because that was as fast as it would go. And I shot 3,000 plus pictures over the course of that day, and I only used about 55 or 60% of the battery from a fully charged battery. On the same token, in working in and around a studio type environment where I'm making one shot and then I'm checking composition and whatnot, I might only get 300 or 400 shots on a battery before I had to recharge the battery because it was 80 to 90% depleted. So one of the problems talking about battery life is, of course, battery life is going to be incredibly dependent on what you are shooting and how you're using the camera. Video, of course, is going to drain it really fast. There's an incredible power load on the camera. But on the flip side, shooting stills in high burst rate or high frame rate bursts tends to result in a lot more footage or a lot more frames per battery than shooting one shot, one off kind of things. So powering the camera is going to be an interesting situation. Now, it does come with a new battery, the LP-E6P. Looking at specifications based on, finding pictures of the battery from Canon and looking at what they're specifying the battery out at, it is a 16 watt hour battery. It's rated at the same 7.2 volts as the LP-E6NH and is in fact rated at the same capacity in milliamp hours, 2130 milliamp hours, as the LP-E6NH. However, apparently, at least according to Canon, the battery chemistry has changed so that it can provide power at a higher current draw. So typically batteries like this are designed around a 1C discharge rate. C is a current draw equivalent to its capacity in milliamps or amps, however you want to look at it. So you basically drop the hours from milliamp hours, and that tells you what you should be drawing the battery at safely. So the LP-E6NH, for example, if it's designed for a 1C discharge rate, would be discharged or capable of being discharged at about 2.13 amps. In theory, this battery is going to be able to supply a higher than 1C discharge rate, or at least that's what Canon is saying. And to be honest, I kind of don't have any problem believing that. The reality is we're asking cameras to do more. They're not being, the processors in them are not being made on the latest silicon process that we have for things like, Apple laptops or phones or whatever. And the more we demand from the processor, the more battery power it's going to take. Couple that with the fact that the camera also now has an accelerator chip in it, in addition to the Digic X processor. I think it's still Digic X. So that's even more computational load. Now, Canon does say that the LP-E6P batteries will be usable in their older cameras, but will require a firmware update. Now, my question there is what cameras will actually see that firmware update? Clearly, older LP-E6 series cameras like the R6 Mark II will get, and the R7, and I'm sure there's a couple, or there's at least one other one that I'm missing, will get a firmware update that will allow them to use the new battery because they are still in production. But like I said, my question is will we see the update? I would expect to see an update on the R5C because it's still in production and still current. But will we see an update, for the example, for the R5 to give us at least just the compatibility with the new battery? Now, as I said, the old NH and N batteries are still compatible, but like the R5, they come with significant limitations in terms of, Canon calls out specifically, Wi-Fi performance, video recording capabilities, and continuous drive speeds. Now, this is the part where things get interesting, because if you were shooting video on a camera like the R5 or the R5C, and even more so the R5 Mark II, because the video capabilities of the R5 Mark II put it more in the league of the R5C than they put it in the league of the R5. most of us are using some kind of external power. Now, Canon says you can power the camera using the AC E6N dummy battery DC coupler and their power supply, the AC adapter, or the AC E6N is the AC adapter, the DC coupler is, I don't remember the part, whatever it is, but that system you can use to power the camera. They also say that the camera cannot be powered with Canon's PDE-1. That's the USB power supply that powers the R5 and the R5C. And the statement in the spec sheet for the camera is, and I quote, "The USB power adapter PDE-1 is not compatible with powering the camera." Now, again, this is where we run into the problem with USB power delivery and camera companies that don't want to be forthcoming about things. So the question now is, do I read that literally as saying that the PDE-1 can't be used to power the camera? Because the PDE-1 is a USB power supply that only provides up to 9 volts at 3 amps. Or do I read that as USB power delivery is not supported anymore? I don't know. And this is where, like, the actual specs and requirements should be stated. Now, that said, however you want to look at it, I went digging, I found a picture of the bottom of the camera on the digital picture. And all consumer electronic products like this will have a rated input voltage on their labeling somewhere. The rated input voltage on the bottom picture, or the picture of the bottom that the digital picture posted, is 15 volts. Now, in the USB power delivery side of things, well, that makes perfect sense in terms of the power interpretation that the power adapter is not compatible with the camera, the PDE-1, but not that USB power delivery is no longer an option. The PDE-1 didn't support a 15-volt output, but regular USB power delivery power supplies, like a good one from Anker, a 45-watt one from Anker or something like that, or your Apple MacBook Pro charger, will have a 15-volt output. So one of the first things I'm going to be doing with my camera is plugging it into an actual USB power supply to see if it will run off of USB power delivery with the 15-volt power profile. If it doesn't work, I mean, this is the good thing about USB power delivery, and the reason that it's safe to do this and you don't have to worry about this kind of test is if the camera and the power source can't agree on the right power profile, 15 volts and whatever amps, the camera doesn't take any, or the power supply and camera don't provide any power. The power supply doesn't send it and the camera doesn't take any power. On the other hand, if it works, it works, and that's, well, it's good news, but it does mean that we are going to need a beefier power supply for our cameras. So, for example, an actual USB power delivery battery pack, or a very solidly built cinema-style battery that provides USB power delivery. Now, there is another side to this that I'm a lot more hesitant to try and test, which is if the camera can take 15 volts, or is rated for 15 volts, then it should be basically compatible with V-mount and Anton Bauer Gold battery packs, the regular cinema stuff, which are nominally 14.4 volts. So that shouldn't be an issue. In fact, it should be able to deal with 12 volts. It should be able to deal with, obviously it can take the batteries, so it can deal with 7.2 to 8.4 volts. Basically, the theory is, and I hope this is the case, I just am really reluctant to try it, is that we should be able to power the camera with a dummy battery and not be so concerned about what voltages that we're powering that battery with. So instead of having to have a battery like we have in the past that converts the voltage down to 8.4 volts or 7.2 volts, we should, in theory, hopefully, be able to just have a dummy battery that passes through right to a V-mount battery's P-tap port, and the camera can run just fine on 15 or 14.4 volts because it's within its design spec. That is the hope. It makes a lot of sense for Canon to do this. There have been plenty of people who have damaged not just R5s and R5Cs, but Sony's and other brands because they put a dummy battery in the camera that didn't have voltage regulation in it and then hooked it up to a P-tap on a regular cinema battery, and 15 volts goes into the camera and poof, there goes your camera. So designing the camera around this voltage as a safe upper limit makes a lot of sense. And of course, internally, the camera has voltage regulation hardware because none of the electronics in the camera run at even 7.4 volts. They run at like 1 volt because they're modern electronics. So the camera is already regulating things. It's just a matter of how much regulation is going on. Okay, that brings me from sort of the outer side of the camera to talking about the inner side of the camera, the sensor, that kind of stuff. 45 megapixels, same ISO range as the R5, and I think this is great. Quite honestly, I think one of the smartest things that Nikon did is with their camera line was not increasing the resolution from the D850. That was their first 45 megapixel camera. The Z7 was 45, the Z9, the Z8, they're all 45 megapixels, and Nikon doesn't seem to be in any rush or really have any desire to go any higher. And quite honestly, the latest generation of the Sony A7R, I think it's the Mark V or whatever, is also not any higher resolution than its predecessor at 60 megapixels. It's just that it's at 60 megapixels. The reality that I don't think a lot of photographers seem to want to accept is that more resolution comes with massively diminishing returns and increasing demands. It demands better lenses. It demands better technique. It demands a better environment that you're working in. Like, I never had problems shooting in a lot of like open, wild conditions with my 30 megapixel R5 or 5D Mark IV and a big telephoto lens. And I have had tons of pictures on the R5 that I've shot on the R5 in similar conditions with the same focal length lens where heat effect in the atmosphere, heat shimmer, just ruins the pictures. On the lower resolution camera, the heat shimmer just didn't fall in as many pixels and it didn't distort the image enough to really be a problem. Technique is a thing that is an issue. If you're like me and you kind of end up doing the lean over, hang off the side on one foot, balancing while half out of breath thing to get a picture, that's way easier to get a sharp picture with if you were shooting a 30 megapixel or a 24 megapixel camera than it is if you're shooting a 45 or a 60 megapixel camera. Diffraction is also an issue. The R5, the R5 Mark II, all of the Nikon 45 megapixel, if it's a 45 megapixel camera, doesn't matter what brand, it's diffraction limited at f7.1, which means that's that much less margin for you to have to stop down to increase depth of field, and the further you step down past that, the softer the images get. Now, yes, we have diffraction correction capabilities in some places. If you use Canon software, in my opinion, it does a tremendously good job at diffraction correction and restoring image quality, from diffraction-related softening. But if, like me, you use Lightroom or Lightroom Classic, diffraction correction's not part of Adobe's feature set, and it's not part of feature sets on a lot of a lot of image processing stuff. It's like shooting in the diffraction range, diffraction limited range isn't helping image quality. So I am quite glad to see that Canon hasn't decided to do either something ridiculous like push the ISOs to 6 million or something like that, or try to push the sensor resolution up to 60 megapixels, or, I mean, anyway, moving along the line, Canon has taken a conservative decision with respect to shutters, or the shutter mechanism on the camera. So it does have all three shutter mechanisms that the R5 has: a mechanical shutter, a first curtain electronic shutter, and an electronic rolling shutter. Now, it's not obvious that you need either the first curtain electronic or mechanical shutter in most cases. From what I can tell from the early stuff that we have, the electronic shutter, you get full 14-bit readout. It doesn't seem that it harms dynamic range appreciably. It's not like the R5 where you only got 12-bit readout for that. There may be some issues that will show up with respect to dynamic range under some further testing when actual tests get done on the camera, but for a lot of situations, it looks like the electronic shutter will probably be the shutter to kind of go with. So, as I said, 14-bit readout, 30 frames a second, a full 30 seconds on the slow end, which is a huge improvement over the half-second limit that the R5 had, to 1/32,000th of a second, so that's 2 stops faster than the 8,000th limit of the R5 and other mechanical cameras. Quite honestly, I would love to see Canon increase the bottom time. Even if it's only for the mechanical shutter, but out to 5 minutes or something like that in third stop increments. Nikon has done this on their cameras. I think it can be incredibly useful because, well, for a lot of situations, especially like in landscape photography, one of the choice shutter speed or exposure time ranges is 2 minutes for sunsets with like blurred out clouds in the sky. And it would be nice to be able to get that like 2-minute exposure without having to go into bulb or setting a timer or doing the long exposure timer setting on the camera, the intervalometer stuff, that kind of thing. The big news on the camera is the rolling electronic shutter readout. So it's not a global electronic shutter. I'm a little disappointed at that. I would have loved to have had a global electronic shutter, but Canon, for whatever reason, isn't ready to do that. Even though, like 5 years ago, they had patented global electronic shutters that didn't have a dynamic range limitation compared to the same pixel architecture as a rolling electronic shutter. So, but being that it is a stacked sensor architecture, which of course means it's backside illuminated because you can't stack a front side illuminated sensor. Canon is saying the electronic rolling shutter time is only 40% of what was on the R5. Or put another way, 60% faster. Now, my back of the envelope calculation says that's about 6.2 milliseconds, maybe a little faster depending on how you actually measured it or the accuracy of your measurements. The digital picture claims 6.3 milliseconds. I don't know how they're measuring it or they measured it or what. And they are saying that the mechanical shutter has a rolling shutter time of 3.4 milliseconds, which would be comparable to what I've measured for the mechanical shutter on the R5 as well. So, yes, mechanical shutters, focal plane mechanical shutters are rolling shutters. And the reason nobody complains about them is they're just fast rolling shutters. Now, to put that in perspective, I am a little bit, disappointed. I would have liked to have seen better numbers. Now, you could argue that Canon is not quite something I don't know, except the R3 was a fully electronic shuttered camera, and that came out when the Z9 came out. The Canon has had plenty of time to figure out how to get the electronic shutter faster and processed and whatnot. So seeing a 6-ish, 6.2, 6.3, whatever, 6.25 millisecond electronic shutter on this is a little bit disappointing to me. The Z9 in my testing comes in around 3 milliseconds when shooting photography stuff. And I measured the R5's mechanical shutter, like I said, at around 4 milliseconds, 3.5, 4. Again, it depends a lot. There's some variance in the testing that you kind of have to account for. So this is not as fast as it could be. I think it's fast enough that you could easily use this for everything. Everything but maybe the fastest situations. I think a 6.4 millisecond rolling shutter is probably going to be good. But there potentially are going to be situations where that first curtain electronic or the mechanical shutter is going to be necessary for dealing with that rolling shutter, as little as it should be, distortion. Now, to put this in some other contexts, 120 frames per second requires an 8.3 millisecond or faster rolling shutter, and 240 frames per second, which the camera will shoot in 1080p or 2K mode, supports, for video at least, supports or requires a 4.1 millisecond or faster shutter. So it's not quite fast enough to do full sensor readouts at 240 frames a second, but this is tricky. Now, here's where my concern comes in. What happens in video mode? So when I tested the Z9, and this has been backed up by other sources that have done things, I found again that the Z9's rolling shutter for photography is fantastic. It's every bit as fast as a mechanical shutter, focal plane mechanical shutter that is out there right now. But once you put the camera into video mode, all that performance goes away. Likely because cameras use a streaming compression process or streaming compression system, and the streaming part of the processing for video is just not capable of keeping up with 3 millisecond shooting without having a problem or something. And so on the Z9, when I tested it, 3 millisecond photo, but it went down to like 15.5 milliseconds when shooting in video, which is fine. It gets up to 60 frames per second, but that's a lot more rolling shutter distortion than you would get in a picture that was shot, or in a frame that's shot at 3 milliseconds. And my concern, or my hope, is that it doesn't happen on the R5 Mark II. If they can do 6.4 milliseconds, as much as that's not as great as it could be, but if they can do 6.4 milliseconds for photos and they can keep 6.4 milliseconds in video mode, this is going to be a very solid video system for those higher action or higher paced action situations. Speaking of all of that stuff, drive mode on the camera. So there are going to be 4 drive modes, apparently. High speed continuous plus, high speed continuous, medium speed continuous, and low speed continuous. And all of these are apparently going to allow us to set frame rates between, or from the list of 30, 20, 15, 12, 10, 7.5, 5, 3, 2, and 1 frames per second. Thank you, Canon. They're also introducing a pre-release shooting mode. It's a 15 frame buffer in RAW, JPEG, or HEIF. Of course, that works out to half of a second prior of shooting, prior to you shooting at 30 frames per second, or half of a second of shooting at 30 frames per second prior to you hitting the shutter release. One question here is going to be if this matches the frame rate that you're shooting at. So does the 15 frame buffer get longer in terms of time? If I'm shooting at, say, 15 frames a second, does it give me a whole second of pre-release shooting? But at least on the plus side, a half second is about twice the reaction time of a person, so you're not going to like miss the shot of the snake striking something or the bird taking off or whatever because you saw it, and as soon as you saw it, you hit the shutter release, but that was too late. The 15 frame buffer should get you back far enough that you get something of what you were looking for. It does have an action priority autofocus mode, which I think is going to be a big deal for sports people. So this is one of those things, when Sony announced the, I think it was A7 R5, and they started talking about it having pose detection. I didn't quite follow what the value of that was. Largely because everything they showed for pose detection was still or nearly still model work. We're not talking about anything really dynamic. And as long as you have a few milliseconds or whatever, the camera is more than capable of finding the head, finding the eye, and focusing on it. Pose detection doesn't, it doesn't really matter that the camera can tell that my arm is outstretched or whatever, because it shouldn't be focusing on my arm, it should be focusing on my eye. Now, the context that Canon is putting this in is in a sporting context. And remember, as long as there is any delay between the shutter being released or the shutter button being pressed and the picture being taken, or the last focus measurement being made and the picture being taken, there has to be a little bit of prediction going on. The camera has to model what the subject's doing to move the focus, because the subject's going to move some in the time between when the last focus measurement was made and when the actual image is captured. Now, of course, the advantage that mirrorless cameras have, like the R5, etc., is that that time is a lot shorter than it was on a DSLR, because you don't have to get a mirror out of the way. But when you start getting into things with some of the other stuff, like subject crossing and obscuration prevention, or dealing with that, then you start getting into things where having the camera have a better understanding of what the thing is doing. Is the player turning around to accelerate into a run? If you've ever done the tracking, played with your tracking settings, one of the things that the camera has that you can adjust is the acceleration rate of your subject. Now, prior to the R5 Mark II and the R1, R3 I think doesn't really do it either. But prior to that, all of this autofocus stuff was sort of very simplistic. Not so much in that it couldn't do things, but in that, for example, rejecting a pole moving in front of a subject was done algorithmically by saying, well, the focus distance changed too much, it's not the subject, don't move the focus, and then after some period of time expired, go, well, I haven't reacquired anything at the focus distance that the subject was at, so focus where the pole is. Not exactly intelligent, and not, I mean, you can make it work. It works very well in some situations, especially if you tune it and you know what it's doing or what you're doing. But definitely something where more smarts in the camera with respect to what's going on can help. And of course, part of all of this too is that it now has the ability, like the R3 has, where you can register faces. Now, the face priority or subject detection, whatever Canon calls it, is obviously super useful for people who are journalists or people who are doing stuff at media events where there are certain people that you want the camera to, or want to focus on, and want their face to be the face that's in focus, and there are a lot of other people that you don't really want the camera to focus on in the process. So that could be really helpful there, and I think that's also being leveraged in the subject crossing obscuration prevention, in that they're saying that the subject can even go out of frame for a short period of time, come back into frame, and the camera will reacquire them. And The only way I see that working is if it kind of can remember what that subject looked like, so that when it, like from a machine learning perspective, so that when it comes back in the frame, it goes, oh, that's the person I was tracking. The other big question I have, and this comes from being a Cinema EOS user. This is being shot on an R5C. The R5C runs the Cinema EOS OS, and the Cinema EOS OS has a different autofocus algorithm than the standard EOS OS for dealing with people in the frame, or more specifically, when people leave the frame. Now, I'm not sure, I'm going to try it right now. I'm not sure if it's going to work properly given the fact that I have a background that's very close to me, and there is a threshold that unfortunately you cannot adjust for this to work. But in theory, on a Cinema EOS camera, if the background is far enough behind the subject, and I have sort of worked up a little closer to the camera, and the subject moves out of frame, the camera is not supposed to refocus on the background. Now, unfortunately, it looks like the camera may have done that because of the distances involved, but when I then walk back into frame, in theory, if the background wasn't such that it caused the camera to actually focus on it, as long as I was the same distance away, I should still be in focus. Now, I can tell from looking at the review or looking at the monitor that that didn't actually happen here, but then I am standing very close to a background that normally wouldn't be necessarily as close behind me. But I think this is a really useful thing when shooting video, to not have the camera go crazy hunting. I've had plenty of shots where the camera on my R5, where the camera lost what I was tracking for whatever reason, and then just decided to start hunting, and it couldn't find anything to focus on. And you know, if you're behind the camera and you see this happening and it's B-roll footage or something like that, that you can hit stop and you can restart the shot and, you know, redo the shot, no big deal. If you are not behind that camera and it's doing this, then it is kind of a big deal. So big question will be, is Canon going to include that in the R5 Mark II, since they are sort of focusing on more cinema-related stuff? Now, that brings me to the video stuff. Video stuff is probably both the biggest thing that's upgraded on this camera and probably where I've got maybe more qualms or questions or whatnot. So, first of all, Canon has done away with the 30-minute record limit, but they haven't done away with artificial record limits completely. Fortunately, the numbers seem to be at least somewhat reasonable. So if you are shooting at 60 frames per second or lower, just standard non-high frame rate shooting, the record limit is 6 hours. If you are shooting at 100 frames per second or faster, the record limit is 2 hours. And yes, you heard me right. You can shoot standard recordings on the R5 Mark II at 100 or 120 frames per second. These are not high frame rate, slow-mo in-camera things. This is actual 100 frame per second or 120 frame per second content should be played back or tagged to playback at 100 frames per second. Now, with high frame rate mode turned on, 200 and 240 frame per second footage can be recorded for 45 minutes, and 120 or 100 frame per second footage can be recorded for an hour and 30 minutes. And yes, you heard me right there too. We now have 10 times slowdown at 24 frames per second, or no, I'm not going to try and do the math in my head, in high frame rate mode. Now, it is limited to 2K resolution, but 240 frames per second, super nice to have. So there are still recording times. If you need a camera, and this is where I think the big question comes in, which is better, the R5 Mark II or the R5C? Well, first point, if you need a camera that can record for longer than 6 hours, the R5 Mark II won't do it. It will have to be an R5C for that function. Now, most of the rest of these limits are actually fairly reasonable. I mean, 2 hours, you know, is more than a quarter in a football game. Like, you're not, like, you could probably shoot an entire high school football game maybe at 120 frames per second, assuming the camera doesn't overheat, without stopping the recording. Now, in practice, you would never do that, but it is in theory possible with the camera. Now, image quality. This actually, I think, is a good one, because this is something I really like about the R5. The R5 Mark II is going to keep both downsampled and line-skipped recording modes, which I think is really nice, because line skipping, you reduce how much data is read out of the sensor, and even though the sensor reads out really fast, if you're reading out half the data, you can read the frame out twice as fast. So in theory, 4K line skipped should have a rolling shutter time down around 2 or 3-ish, 3.1-ish milliseconds or whatever that would be, compared to, or maybe even lower because we're talking video, so it doesn't read the full frame. So down around high 2 milliseconds or low 3 milliseconds, in theory it could do that, which it starts getting you into the whole, I don't really need to worry about rolling shutter for things like helicopter blades or whatever. I just switch the camera into line skipped mode, and presumably, if it works anything like the R5 does, get that improved rolling shutter readout. So in sports, action, that kind of thing, and I've talked about this before, but in sports, action, that kind of thing, having the highest resolution or the highest quality is not really as useful because you've got motion blur all over the place. So you have people moving quickly. The image quality is going to be degraded from, you know, if you want to think of it that way, because of the motion blur. That motion blur isn't going to, or stepping down from downsampled to line skipped gets rid of, potentially, at least it does on the R5, gets rid of a lot of the rolling shutter problem. And with the motion blur that you're already dealing with, the image quality doesn't really change much. So having that option, in fact, this is something I wish my R5C could do more easily. Having the option to pick between line skipped and downsampled, I think is a really good tool when it comes to dealing with fast moving subjects. Now, Canon has chosen an interesting way to implement this. When you are doing downsampled, which they're calling fine mode, you have two options, 4K and 2K, which I should also point out, the camera now supports 2K DCI, so 2048 by 1080, as well as full HD or 2K UHD, which would be 1920 by 1080. So you've got the wider 17 by 9 aspect ratio and the narrower 16 by 9 aspect ratio of your choice. So 4K, either way, is downsampled from 8K, so it's only a 2x downsample. 2K, either way, is downsampled from 4K. So again, it's only a 2x downsample, which is a little bit different from like the R5C, where this 2K footage is actually being downsampled from 8K, so it's a 4x downsample. Now this, of course, does have some limitations in terms of dynamic range and noise performance and so forth, because you aren't going to get quite as much recovery of or suppression of noise as you would if you went from 8K to 2K, but because it should be only reading out 4K, and in theory that's going to be a line-skipped 4K downsampled to 2K, then rolling shutter time should be faster, which is a plus, and the power consumption should be lower, which is a plus, instead of reading out the full 8K and going down. Of course, on the line skipping side, you have full 8K native readout, which really isn't line skipped, and then you would have 4K, which would be 2 lines read, 2 lines skipped, and then you would have 2K, which I think is 2 lines read and 3 lines skipped. Yeah, 2 lines read, 3 lines skipped, or 2 lines read, 4 lines, whatever it is. I had it in my head before I started this video, and it just, whew. So like I said, there are really positive rolling shutter implications from all of that. And of course, line skipping is going to be necessary for shooting 2K at 240 frames a second, because your 6.3 millisecond rolling shutter time from the electronic shutter is not fast enough. You need to be under, I think it's 4 milliseconds or something like that for 240 frames per second to work. Now, that said, some things I'm not thrilled about. There is a movie crop mode like the R5 has and so forth. It is a 1.6 crop factor, so it's APS-C. It is not Super 35. Super 35 should be around a 1.4, 1.46, something to that, 1.39, depending on just which Super 35 format you're talking about. But something in that range. It's a little disappointing to me that the cropped format is 1.6 and there isn't a Super 35 option the way there is on the R5C. Yeah, I guess I kind of understand. It is consistent with the rest of the regular EOS cameras, but it would be nice to be able to either select that or have Super 35 and 1.6 as options, because by and large, the rest of the capabilities of this camera are very close to being Cinema EOS-like. The dynamic range, the readout, etc., which we'll talk about in a second, it's there. It's got the capability that it supports C-Log2, and it's not the complaint. Well, we'll talk about C-Log2 in a minute. So I already talked about frame rates. I already talked about 2K, DCI 2K being an option now, where Full HD was the only option on the R5, which I think is nice to have. There's also, from the manual or from the spec sheet, there's also at least 5, I'm counting it right, 5 new quality options. So I don't know how this is all going to play out, but the manual is showing high quality intraframe compressed, standard quality intraframe compressed, and light or low quality intraframe compression, as well as standard and light for long gap, or IPB is what it used to be called, but the terminology is all being realigned with the Cinema EOS OS side of things. Now, the last major topic on the camera that I want to talk about here is something a lot of people have been chomping about, and I have been frustrated with the whole discussion for a long time, which is C-Log2. The R5 Mark II has C-Log2. Now, Canon is saying that you have to shoot in 4K 30p fine mode to get the full 16 stops of dynamic range that C-Log2 can shoot, or can handle on this camera. Now, I don't quite follow their math on that one. The sensor is 14 bits, it's linear readout, so that's 14 stops maximum dynamic range. Now in practice, you won't get 14 stops of dynamic range because there's noise, and so that doesn't quite work. Now downsampling from 8K to 4K, which is what you get in 4K fine, will reduce the area of the image, or the number of pixels, by a factor of 4. Because that reduces by a factor of 4, noise reduces by a factor of the square root of 4, or 2. So we should see a one-stop gain and theoretical gain in dynamic range from going from 8K to 4K. So 15 stops is what I come up with, but in practice it's not going to be 15 stops, because you're never going to have 14 stops, a perfect 14 stops coming out of the sensor. Now, that said, what this really is going to do is open a ton of doors and a ton of caveats about questions in terms of what the ideal curve should be. Because contrary to popular note or myth or discussion on the internet, C-Log2 is not the best log format from Canon. There is no best log format from Canon, or anybody else for that matter. All log curves are a compromise to squeeze more dynamic range into fewer bits. The more dynamic range you squeeze into those fewer bits, the more you have to compromise the precision that you can store brightness changes at. C-Log2 makes the compromise to take approximately 18 or 18 and a half stops and squeeze that into 10 or 12 bits, which if it was a linear file would only be able to support 10 or 12 stops respectively. C-Log3, which is also on the camera, chooses to take about 16 and a half stops or something like that, 16 stops, 16 and a third stops, and squeeze that into the same 10 or 12 bits. It's not quite the same because they don't use exactly the same black levels, but the short of it is if you ever sit down and do the math with the equations that Canon has published, C-Log3 will have about 30 to 40% more information in most of the upper level of the image. So the entire highlights range down to about, I think it's a stop if I remember correctly, under 18%. Below that, there's like 2 stops where C-Log2 does a little bit better, and then both of them are basically going to be limited by whatever your sensor can actually put out, or essentially that. So the question then becomes, where do you want to shoot C-Log2 versus C-Log3? Or just don't you care about giving up the image quality when you have to do, or when you do that? Obviously, shooting in the fine modes where the downsampling is taking place, coupled with the fact that the processor has a 14-bit readout, C-Log2 becomes a reasonable option. Now, this is, of course, the big difference between the R5 Mark II and the R5 or the R5C. They have 12-bit readouts. They don't get the same starting point that the R5 Mark II has. So there's a huge disadvantage there. And in fact, when you do the math, I've got a video coming on this at some point looking at this specifically. Now, that said, if you were shooting in the line skipped modes, you might not actually want to use C-Log3 or 2 because the line skipped modes aren't going to have the dynamic range that the downsampled modes have. So now it becomes this whole devil in the details thing. Now, I'm glad Canon put it there. I'm not going to say that they shouldn't have put it in the camera, because the reality is the R5 Mark II 14-bit readout, the sensor can support C-Log2 vastly better or more. It supports it in a way that the R5 and the R5C really can't with the limitations that their sensors have. That said, of course, all of this needs some real testing to see what exactly is going to happen and how this is exactly going to play out. Quite honestly, personally, if I was shooting C-Log2, I really would love to have 12 bits instead of 10 so that I don't have to make the compromise between precision and dynamic range. I have enough bits to have good precision, or better, nearly equal precision to C-Log3, or at least closer precision to C-Log3, coupled with the wider dynamic range. So, with that said, let me wrap this up by talking about what you can expect on the channel in the future and what I'm doing and how this is all playing out. So I have already pre-ordered an R5 Mark II. I have pre-ordered a BGR20 battery grip that is primarily going to be my standard grip when I am shooting with the camera in the field doing photography. And I have pre-ordered a CFR20EP, the cooling fan grip, for when I'm shooting video with it. Oh, and 3 extra batteries because they're going to be important. Now, I have some open questions about the cooling fan grip. I'm not sure how necessary it's going to be. Again, I don't shoot a lot of 8K footage. I don't shoot a lot of 4K fine. I don't even shoot 4K. The vast majority of everything I shoot is in 1080p, and 1080p shouldn't be an issue at all on the R5 Mark II. But on the same token, this channel is about testing things on the camera, and it's hard to test it's hard to test things like cooling and recording performance and recording time and so forth if you don't have that cooling grip. Now, I have no intention of replacing my R5C with the R5 Mark II. It is going to replace my R5. My R5C is still going to be my standard camera as far as I can see for shooting video. Some of that comes down to some of the feature set that is in the R5C, like shutter angles. I don't see anything that indicates the R5 has shutter angles. If it does, then that may be a big game changer. But without it, it's an issue for me. Now, if you are a follower on the channel or a subscriber, I have two major series of tech tips running on this channel. One is for the R5, and the other is for the R5C. As I said in my State of the Channel video last month, my intention is to run the R5 tech tip thing to its inevitable conclusion. When I have covered all of the relevant stuff on the camera that I can cover, then I will end that and move on. The same thing with the R5C. A lot of this also comes down to the fact that a lot of the functionality in the R5, the R5C, even the R5 Mark II is the same, because Canon doesn't rewrite everything from scratch every new camera that comes out. They build on the previous cameras. So starting up an R5C Tech Tips series, which I will do, is going to be focused on the things that the R5C does new or differently or has that the R5 doesn't have, versus rehashing things like how to move your autofocus point. Now, on the other hand, I'm not entirely sure how to address that sort of issue in terms of findability and people looking for things, because I know people will get an R5C or an R5 Mark II, go looking for R5 Mark II, how do I move the autofocus point? And my video is for the R5, so yeah, not sure about that one. But that is a logistics thing for me to figure out more than it is a problem with what the content on the channel. So R5 series will continue. R5C series will continue, and I will still be shooting almost everything probably with the R5C. I don't see that changing. R5 Mark II series will start when I get my camera. I will be immediately looking at some things like powering it externally and so on and so forth, and we'll start off from there. But I'm not planning on making any major changes just because there is new hardware, other than the fact that I will be talking about new hardware as well. So with all of that said, I am going to wrap this up here. This has gone on for an hour longer than I really wanted it to go on, but it is what it is. These cameras are just complicated. So if you found this useful or at least interesting, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you aren't already. If you'd like to help and support this channel, please help us. Hit that like button, share this video, leave a comment. All of that helps YouTube figure out that this video isn't nothing, or that they should actually recommend it. And of course, if you would like to support us directly, you can do so by hitting the thanks button, or buying yourself, I should say, something from one of the affiliate links in the description below. You know, whatever it is that you have always wanted, essentially. With that said, thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking along through a long podcast, and I hope to see you next time.